ever invite an arborist to come give a talk, certainly they're always willing to do so. So Tracy and Trees Knoxville both, thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here. As Tracy mentioned with my bio, I was very lucky. I was one that instinctively loved trees and plants as a whole, and then I decided to go back and study more about them. Plant tree physiology really enthralled me. I always loved the way that trees not only developed and built themselves up, but also the way that they took themselves down. So by following my heart, I eventually made my way to school. And again, as Tracy mentioned, doing my research in Great Smoky Mountains National Park was a great opportunity for me to take a bunch of life lessons and tree lessons, not only here in East Tennessee, but worldwide, from the forest and into the urban setting. So that's what I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about today, and that is, of course, the establishment, the management, and selection of trees, or selection, establishment, and management. So I want to start first with selection. As you can tell, we're at UT Gardens. We're in their wonderful greenhouse, or hoop house, I guess is a better term for this. And we're going to look at a few different types of plant stock today. Now, you probably know that plant stock comes in three primary ways. The first being, of course, container-grown plants. A lot of our trees come in containers. But we also have balled and burlap trees. You've probably seen those as well. Now, I don't have a balled and burlap tree with me today. They're generally really heavy and really large trees, so I don't have those. But the third way is, of course, what are known as bare root plantings, or whips, or maybe saplings. And each of these different techniques, or these different styles of tree, of course, they have their pros and their cons. Now, container plants, I certainly love, because you can plant a container plant or a container grown tree most any time of the year. Now, we do have some issues with container grown plants with regards to encircling roots or girdling roots, as you may have heard of. And that's a very common thing that we see. You've probably seen some of what I consider the good, the bad, and the ugly. So this is certainly an ugly version. The roots have not only become so pot bound, they've actually extended outside of the container and into the nursery tray. Next, we have another individual here, juniper species, just a hard mass of roots. So this is certainly one we wouldn't want to select. The roots are brown and discolored rather than this nice white and healthy. Boy, we are getting rained on here. So we're gonna have to keep on trucking. So you can go back under the umbrella if you'd like, Olivia. Now, again, the most common way that we receive our plants are these container-grown trees. But in all honesty, when we think in terms of a large mature tree that's balled and burlap, a lot of times what we see is a tree that really is experiencing. Yeah, let me do this. So what I was mentioning is that, with our balled and burlap trees, of course, what we see oftentimes on balled and burlap trees are trees that were most likely, they grew up somewhere very far away from the planting site. Some of these plants come from Washington, Oregon, and far away. McMinnville is a very common place where these trees that are balled and burlap, they may have been growing in a really loamy soil, something that has a lot of sand in it so that they can get quickly to market size. But when we dig that plant, of course, we kill a lot of those fibrous absorbing roots. And then we pick that plant up and we deliver it, 50, 60, 70 miles across the state. And we bring it here to East Tennessee, planted in clay and rock in our urban soil. So trees that are balled and burlap oftentimes will go into the ground and they may sit there stagnant for a few years. Now, as I was saying, container grown plants are not ideal either. Sometimes they will create those girdling roots, but those we can fix fairly well. So me as an arborist, I really am a huge fan of planting these bare root trees. They may come smaller in caliper size from the beginning, but a lot of times we can see a really healthy specimen that's planted correctly, even outgrow that of a larger, mature, balled and burlap tree. So picking the right specimen for your site is really important. And that may well mean a larger tree than a smaller tree, but in some instances, if you have years to let it develop and grow, try and start with some of those smaller plant stock and plant them correctly. We're going to walk, Olivia and I, over to this other side of the greenhouse, and we're going to look at some other things that I want you to avoid when you're actually selecting healthy nursery stock, and some things that we'd like to see. So a lot of times our plants come as grafted trees, and you've probably heard of a graft where a scion is ultimately, you know, grafted to a rootstock. The scion being the top part of the tree that we want, the rootstock being a separate individual. Now, the reason we do that is a lot of times for hybrid vigor or disease resistance, sometimes pest resistance. But what I want you to be careful at looking at is the graft unions. So I'll show you in a moment a really good and a really bad graft union. So it's important that we do look at that. In addition to this, I also want you to look at the depth of the plant. So how deep is that root ball actually planted? If we pull this back, we see that there's really no trunk taper here. And that tells me that this plant was, you know, the soil was brought up too high on that main stem. Now that becomes a really major problem when we go and we plant that in the tree, or in the ground, excuse me. Look at these two graft unions. Here, one that's not doing extremely well. It has taken, but it definitely has a pretty severe kink into it, as opposed to this one neighboring that has a little bit better of a graft union that has begun to compartmentalize or close fully. So that's what we want to keep an eye out for, as well as planting depth. Now, also, when we're in the nursery, a lot of times, you know, plants get moved around a lot, and a lot of times they will fall over, and that can lead to injuries on the trunk. So when I see a plant that has fallen over, you know, number one, I want to pick it up, but number two, I want to really inspect that main stem to make sure that there are no major trunk injuries on it. That is something that we want to use a lot of caution with, and we want to make sure that the taper or the widening of the base is pretty well developed. You see some that have good trunk taper and others that do not have quite as good of a developed taper. Okay, let's get you underneath an umbrella, Olivia. All right, so from there, Olivia and I are actually going to go walk out in the garden just a minute. It's unfortunate we've been here for the last hour and haven't had any rain. And of course, the second we start shooting, it's a downpour. So let's run out to the gardens here, and we're going to look at some of these actual nursery stock items that are now out in the UT gardens. Hopefully some of you have been here at this point. What Olivia is looking at now is, of course, our trial vegetable garden. So it's a kitchen garden, if you will. And just to her left, we also have the spiral herb garden. It's a beautiful area out here, but today, of course, we're here to talk about trees. So all right, so now we've moved out to the gardens. Luckily, it stopped raining for just a minute here, which may be great. So this is Fagus grandifolia, American beech. It's a wonderful species. It's actually what I did do my master's research on, but it wasn't really in an urban setting. What I want to talk today about is really establishing that plant. First and foremost, after we've selected, you know, our species from the greenhouse or a big box store, it's really important that we understand the cultural requirements of that plant. So is it designed to be in full sun or shade? How often have we seen a dogwood tree out in the middle of a front yard in an urban setting in full sun? Now, when we think about dogwoods, where do they generally grow? Now, in the forest, we see dogwoods as an understory species. So more often than not, we're seeing those in locations where it's almost full sun. but yet we love to put them in front yards. Oftentimes I see evergreens that'll be established underneath really dense shade of neighboring trees. Another major problem, since many of our evergreens actually need about 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day. How often, we heard Jim talk a little bit last week about those trees that go in areas where they really shouldn't. We've seen river birches, sycamores, willows out in really dry environments, dry spots in the yard, and we wonder why they don't thrive very well. Well, because these are species that more often should be next to a riverbed, a stream, a creek, or some other major body of water. So certainly they can work well in those low-lying areas, but when we put them in an urban front yard, that oftentimes doesn't work and leads to early tree death. Next is planting those trees properly. We spend hundreds of dollars on nursery stock. I mean, some of us more than that, certainly me. Why not go ahead and plant that tree appropriately so that you can get many years / centuries out of a well-established tree? Now, the problem I see a lot of times on planting is enough time is just not taken to plant the tree. However long you spend researching what tree you want, I want you to spend 5 times that amount actually determining the best way to plant that tree. And that's where places like Trees Knoxville can help. UT Extension offices can help. A lot of times we hear, plant whatever the size of the root ball is, put a hole 2 to 3 times the size of that. And that certainly can be acceptable for some of those smaller trees, but if I'm planting a semi-mature tree, even up to 1 inch in depth, I want a huge planting pit. I almost say about 10 foot in diameter of area is what I like to see tilled up and ready to plant into. Couple reasons. Number one, we're establishing loose soil in that entire area. It allows us to amend that soil if it's needed, add some organic content. But more importantly, when we just plant into a clay bowl that's only 2 times the size of the root ball, what happens to those roots? Well, a lot of times when we're working on tilling up that soil right in that planter pit, well, what's that soil? It's very loose. So those roots, rather than wanting to venture far away from the tree trunk out radially and go out into the native soil, they'll instead start to just encircle themselves, because that soil in that planter hole, that planted hole, is much looser than the native soil. Now we can reduce that a little bit by helping to deglaze the sides of very heavy clay planter pits. You can do that with, just a shovel, create some nice slices through that clay to reduce that hard pack, because when we put the shovel in the ground, we glaze the side of that clay area. So that said, I really want to encourage you not to make the hole the size of the root ball or 2 times. Make it 5, 6 times the root ball. Plan to do some digging. Spend a lot of time making sure that tree goes in the ground correctly, and that of course means the correct height. I know it was raining a little aggressively in there, but when I talk about trunk taper, that's the flare at the base of the tree where the trunk meets the ground. And I always want to see that. If you have a choice, I would much rather see you plant a tree 1 inch or 2 high than 2 or 3 inches low. It's almost a surefire way to kill a tree early if they're planted too low. That moisture just retains against the bark surface, and what we see over time is the bark eventually separate. So now we've selected our species, we understand the cultural requirements, we've got a nice planter pit, we're ready to put our tree in the ground, it goes in the ground well. What do we do from there? Well, a couple things. First and foremost, I want to talk about structure pruning, because structure pruning is very important in a tree's long-term survival. It cannot be understated. Spending 15 minutes when a tree is this size, even 30 minutes on a tree of this size, can really give this tree centuries of growth without any problems. But we're going to look at some problems that do occur when we don't structure prune. Now, before we talk about structure pruning, I do want to indicate we don't generally structure prune immediately after planting the tree. Now, if there's a dead limb or a broken branch from planting, certainly it's acceptable to cut off a limb or two. But our structure pruning, we really wait about 2, maybe 3 years. And that allows that tree to establish some good, well-developed roots before we go in and start removing live bulbs. We're going to look at some of the issues that I cut off early in life so that they don't become major structural problems later in life.
Ali?
Yes.
Quick question from Sherry. She wants to know what type of tree that was again, or is
American beech.
Thank you.
Grandifolia.
What was the Latin?
Fagus, F-A-G-U-S, grandifolia, G-R-N-D-I-F-O-L-I-A. So I want to look first starting here at the base of this tree. So you notice how well developed that trunk taper is. This is what I really like to see. This is a tree that was really planted at an appropriate height. Even if we come in here and we add an inch of mulch, maybe 2 inches, we still are going to be able to see this well-developed root flare. So this tells me this tree was planted really, really well. Now, what I don't like to see on this tree, though, are issues of codominance. So do you see in this area, I hope you're able to see these two limbs here where this main trunk is rubbing aggressively against a secondary stem that's trying to develop here in the main canopy. So over the long haul, this very, very tight branch union becomes susceptible to failure. As these two stems increase in girth each year, they effectively push themselves apart. In addition to that, we also have issues of rubbing or competing limbs. So if you see where these two limbs are rubbing together, over time, one of those two limbs will ultimately lose that battle. So if we stand back and look at this tree again as a whole, we also see that it really doesn't look like a tree. It kind of looks like a bush, more or less. And that's as a result of it just coming out of the pot, going into the ground, and being left to grow. I really encourage, if you're going to spend money investing in a tree, investing in a company to come in and install that tree, spend a little bit of money structure pruning it, or even go out with your own hand snippers. Anything is better than nothing when it comes to structure pruning, because we really cut those structural defects off at the pass early in life. The second reason I like to structure prune is because when we structure prune, we're trimming off really small limbs. When we let a tree mature, we then have to turn around and remove really large diameter limbs. Large diameter limbs simply don't heal at the same rate as those small, immature limbs. All right. Got all 4 of them?
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So hopefully now you can see 4 total trees here. I know it's a little far away, but I'm going to talk about primarily, so this is a European beech. We've got a flamethrower redbud, a sweet gum, and a cedar tree down here at the far left of the trail. But I want to talk about, number one, we've selected our tree. We've got it established in the ground. We've started our structure pruning. So what do we do next? Well, not a whole lot. We really just want to enjoy those trees after they've been structure pruned. But there are a couple other considerations that you have to keep in mind. One of them being environmental factors, such as abiotic issues like wind and sun. And I'm going to show a couple examples of how the wind affects our trees and how the sun affects our trees. If we look at all 4 of these trees, I hope you're able to see this as well as Olivia and I can, but the European beech tree here has a slight lean off to the right. The redbud has a pretty heavy droop down there to the right. The sweet gum has a fairly significant lean, as well as the cedar tree down there. Now that's as a result of those high winds coming in from the south, and they're able to cut fairly easily through this grove of pin oak trees. And now by doing that, of course, that exercises the trees. And exercise is good for a tree but too much can add stress and undue problems, I guess, later in life. Now, trees have coped with wind for millions of years. Their roots develop in a way that allows them to feed both off of tension and compression. As that tree trunk sways over time, it will help to develop roots on that uphill side of the tree or the windward side of the tree. So don't fear wind, but what I would encourage you to do is find out where your predominant winds come from, and rather than just putting the tree in the ground, establish where that wind is coming from. And I want you to orient that terminal bud into the wind. That way, as the wind blows, it fights that main stem that's going to be developing up into a central leader, rather than continuing to push on it year after year until it ultimately damages or deforms the tree.
Hey, Lee, could you repeat what you said about the terminal bud and maybe go a little deeper into what that is in case?
Oh, absolutely. So the terminal bud is simply the very uppermost bud on the tree. So I should have talked a little more about central leaders in the greenhouse, but what I'll do is we'll get down here at this limb, this red bud, and I'll show you just what I'm talking about here. So when we look at a tree, basically we have what are known as lateral branches, and of course our main stem or our main trunk. And on that main trunk is going to be a terminal bud, and that is just the bud at the very, very uppermost growing tip of the tree. So in this situation, I would have certainly liked to have planted this tree into the wind so that that terminal bud was in this orientation. So over time, it would have had to have fought against the wind rather than just being pushed over with the wind. Because keep in mind, that terminal bud is where the new growth emerges every year. So what does that tell us for the fate of this tree? It can only continue to go one direction, and we can't necessarily correct that at this stage. Now, certainly trees are self-righting organisms, so we're going to see a lot of these lateral shoots fill in over time to help reduce the amount of weight that does occur on that terminal growing tip. But certainly this tree could have benefited by being rotated 180 degrees here and put into the predominant wind. So this should give a little better view. You know, here again, we've got a little bit of, a bend in this sweet gum tree. So we see kind of that same situation as well as on the cedar. So just keep in mind, high winds definitely have a role, those abiotic things that are non-living, but they still influence our trees. It's very important to keep that in mind, in addition to the biotic things that affect our trees.
Hey, we have a good question from Nancy. Can you hear me, Lee?
Yes, go ahead.
Nancy wants to know, is there anything that could be done now to correct the terminal bud issue on that tree you just showed us?
So there are. You can head back that terminal bud to help encourage some of that lateral growth formation. And eventually what will happen is you'll see new shoots develop. And at that point, you'll want to establish one of those new shoots or those sucker growths as your central leader. So where it arced over heavily, we could find a location to make a subordination cut, reduce that overall length, and allow a new strong central leader to develop. Again, it's better if you can do that prior, because I'm not a huge fan of subordinating limbs, but sometimes it is warranted. So that would be my suggestion on a tree that you don't have control over if you've inherited one. Okay, next we're going to move away from wind and we're going to talk about the sun now, right? Trees are phototropic organisms, meaning they chase sunlight no matter where it is. You may not have heard that word, but if you've ever had a house plant, you've seen phototropism in action. We see trees orient themselves. We see flowers turn towards the light. Sometimes we see them turn away from the light. But if we look at this dogwood, wonderful American dogwood, a great specimen, and it looks beautiful on this side. You know, it's a little wilted. We've had some dry weather here recently. And this one does get a good deal of sunlight. So, I mean, there's a little wilt to it, but it's not in horrible shape. But the front looks beautiful. But Olivia, if we walk around the back side of this tree, what do we see? We see a very different story on this tree. So now what do we see here? We see a very open center with very few limbs that have developed on this side. Now that's as a result, and we'll walk this way in a minute, but we've got really mature oak trees behind us. So what I would encourage here is that you can't really do a whole lot about this, but if you want a really symmetrical tree, it's ideally not going to be planted at the edge of a heavily shaded area, such as a forest edge. We've all seen redbuds alongside the interstate. Where do? They grow out 10, 20 feet out over towards the medians. And that's as a result of them chasing that sunlight. And that's why we see one side of a dogwood that's full, whereas the other side is absent of growth. Now, I'm going to talk next. We're kind of going to go freeform from here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about management at this stage. I didn't really develop this talk to be necessarily, you know, a perfect form. I just wanted to walk through the gardens and kind of show some of the consequences of good and bad planting practices. One thing that we want to really keep at the forefront of our mind is injuries. A lot of times our nursery stock will move many times before it gets to our hands. It may be through nursery personnel, it may be the landscaper getting the tree to us, and all of those have the potential to lead to trunk injuries. Now, this likely wasn't an injury created through moving. It's probably either a squirrel or I'm not sure what. You know, a kid could have come over and done something accidentally, not knowing what they were doing. But little minor injuries that seem insignificant can actually be pretty detrimental to trees because they allow a point of inoculation for wood decaying organisms. And that's also true on our root system. So we see a root here that has, again, kind of been opened up as a result, maybe a weed eater. So it's really important that we protect not only the lower trunk, but also the upper trunk. In particular, what I see a lot are girdled trees as a result of weed whackers and lawnmowers. Again, this is why I really want to emphasize, don't just plant a 2-foot wide root ball. Put the tree in a 10-foot area that is its own established landscape bed. That keeps weed eaters, it keeps lawnmowers, and it keeps people out of that area. So it can be really great long term. If we look at this one more time, we see that this tree is planted a little high. And I'm okay with that because at this point, we can still bring in mulch, which luckily I'm here a day early. Otherwise, the UT Garden staff would have this down, where we're going to have mulch to the appropriate level at this point. So that's a good thing to see. Now, this is, of course, a Japanese maple, and it's doing spectacular here because it is in shade. That's where it's designed to be, not out in a front yard in full sun. So we see leaves that are just full of pressure. They're fully inflated. And this tree really couldn't be happy. Stay too long on this tree, but this is another mature pin oak, spectacular species. And you see what we have here is really, really high quality mulch that's been applied properly. This is what I like to see. We all know the woes of volcano mulching, where we come out and there will be mulch 10 or 12 inches up that main trunk. Definitely do not volcano mulch at this point. We know the problems associated with that. But what we can see here is still a really nice developed trunk flare, or that trunk paper that we discussed in the greenhouse.
I have a question from Sandra. She wants to know about the split trunk on the J maple. Is that bad or good?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And that is, again, what we're trying to prevent by structure pruning early in life. That one, if you can look at that, Olivia, that one I am not overly worried with. And the reason I say that is because of the angle of the branch unions. So when the branch union is less than 60 degrees, or it creates a very tight V-shaped branch union, that's when I get a little worried. On a small understory Japanese maple, I'm not too worried about that one because they're fairly well separated. Now, here in about maybe 10 minutes, we're going to see what happens when the tree gets very mature, and we'll talk about that there. At this stage, you can't really fix that, though. I would not recommend coming in and removing one whole half of the tree. That's why I say a lot of times, arboriculture is something that you have to do on a preventative scale, not a reactive scale. So you should be out there early structure pruning those trees, not calling an arborist after you see the two trunks already rubbing together. So again, I just want to promote and encourage structure pruning. And if we actually look at this small Japanese maple, I forgot to mention this guy, but look at the phototropic effect on it. Not a single leaf growing on that back side as a result of it trying to climb and reach for that sunlight.
Okay, I have a question. Can you hear me, Lee?
Yes, go right ahead.
When there is a wound, like the trunk wound shown earlier, is there a dressing or treatment that should be done to assist healing?
Years ago, it was thought that we would paint and cover that surface. There are situations where pruning paint can be acceptable when we're trying to limit disease spread, but it is very, very rare. When we have an injury or a pruning cut on a tree, in general, you want to leave that wood exposed. The reason being is if you spray paint or put some application over that pruning cut, you retain the moisture that's in that tree, and it actually expedites rot behind that pruning paint. So much like a scab on you or I, it needs to dry, it needs to get wet, it needs to dry. But in essence, again, this is the role of promoting early tree pruning, because think in terms of pruning off a limb that's the size of your pinky versus pruning off a limb that's the size of your shoulder. A pinky cut can seal in as little as maybe a single growing season if it's an active, healthy growing species. But if you cut off a limb that's 4 or 5 inches in diameter, you're really pushing the limits of what a tree can compartmentalize or close. If you were on last week's call with Jim, we learned that trees don't heal, they compartmentalize. That cut or that injury is permanent. It will always remain in the tree. So reduce the size of your pruning cuts where possible through structure.
All right, I have another question about powdery mildew on young dogwoods. These were supposed to be a mildew-resistant species, and they were doing great in the dappled shade before infestation. Now they're severely affected. The dogwood in the sunnier location is without infection. So since it's exposed to less humidity, so I guess.
You just hit it on the head, yes. Of course, cultivars that are resistant are ideal, but what you just have noticed in your own yard is very observant. That's right. Fungal pathogens like two things. They like shade and they like moisture. So like you mentioned, the dogwood in full sun probably is doing better as a result of there not being that moisture retention. You can reach out to me if you're here in Knox County, and we can talk about treatments and potential fungicides that can help us to control that. I would like to know a little more about that before I talk too far into it. But so that said, next I want to move to another part of the garden, and this is what I like to call the tale of two tulip poplars. I heard someone say that their favorite tree was a tulip poplar. Joining us early. They're spectacular trees. Of course, they grow to enormous sizes, but they do grow so rapidly that a lot of times we see failures on these. So if you notice this first tulip poplar tree here to my left, just in front of the gazebo, we have a wonderful, nice, straight trunk, a central leader with good scaffold branching off to the left and right. Couldn't be a more spectacular tree. Has the survival, the potential for long-term survival. But if we move over to this neighboring tree, I want to talk about one of the things that we want to cut off when we're looking at structure pruning a tree, and that is codominant. Olivia, I hope you can zoom in slightly on that. If you notice, there's about a 4-foot tear on this tree trunk, and that is because this tulip poplar started its life as a codominant tree, meaning it had twin trunks, and it had a very, very tight branch union. In other words, one that looks almost like a V-shaped branch union, where those two individual stems met one another. Now, through whipping of the winds, heavy weight, rains, potentially ice, we see those limbs very commonly split apart. If you've owned a sugar maple tree, or if you've driven in the neighborhood, you've probably seen a sugar maple tree that was laying in the yard as a result of that codominance, those twin stems. So here again, a 5-minute cut early in life could have helped to prolong the life of this tulip poplar. Okay, so now we've moved over to another area of the gardens here. That's kind of the shade garden area. And I want to talk a little bit about overcrowding of our landscapes. All too often we plant trees when they're young and we think they're going to remain that size, but they rarely do. A lot of times they will ultimately overgrow, sometimes even what they say on the tag. If they're in a really good spot where they're happy, some plants can grow outside of the bounds of what they say on the tag. What we see here is a little bit of competition between these two trees. So the Japanese maple just overtaking its neighboring tree. Now over time that will deform both trees, but generally one of those two trees is going to win that battle. So make sure spacing is appropriate in your landscape. Next, I'd like to get a little closer here, and we're going to look at an established root zone on this Japanese maple. So, as I mentioned earlier, when we're planting trees, it is really important that we lay those roots out in a radial fashion, almost like spokes on a wagon wheel. It is very, very important. If we don't, and we just developed a little clay pit, those roots are going to encircle. Now, this is a great example of a really well done tree, but we do have one major issue that I imagine you already see at this point. And that is one girdling limb, or root, excuse me, that has ultimately kind of cut in and begun to fuse with this main trunk here. Now, over the long haul, this can be problematic, but ideally, when this was younger, we could have come in and made a single snip when it was this size of a root. Now, I still am not opposed to cutting a root of this size as long as we do it during the dormant season, and we are very careful with our cuts to not injure the remaining trunk or root systems. But if we look at the overall of this, we see nice radial roots out here. We see wonderful radial roots out here. And you can see that these roots literally extend out well beyond where that original pit would be. So that's why I really encourage you to make the hole 10 foot in diameter. That way, those roots, as soon as they start running out, by the time they hit the native clay, they're already big roots and they have a greater capacity to really root into that native soil. If you are here in Knox County, of course, as your county extension agent, I'm here to help those residents. So don't hesitate to call me if you have a question about a tree, selecting a tree, proper planting practices, whatever it may be. And it's not just trees, it's any woody ornamental. So thank you for that. And definitely, Talking Trees with Lee is my video series. I try and post a video a week. So if you'd like other information, you can Google that. Next, I want to talk a little bit about a pin oak. So if we notice over here, we have a large pin oak tree that was removed. Now we're learning that pin oak trees are really not great species. If they're planted in soils that have a really high pH, in other words, they're alkaline soils, they get very chlorotic or yellow, and they ultimately live a shorter lifespan. So we've learned that pin oaks, while a great species, if they're not sited properly, you can run into issues. Now this one ultimately was lost as a result of a bacterial leaf scorch that can be problematic in some of our mature pin oak trees. But I don't want to talk so much about that as I do want to talk about the neighboring tree. So when we lose a large mature tree, when we've had trees that have grown up together with one another, suddenly new trees that are around in the area experience new wind currents that they've never seen before. And that would certainly be the case with this mature pin oak. So now this tree is exposed, and certainly it is a little bit more in a situation where high winds could roll through and potentially push this tree over. Now that's not to say that that is what's going to happen, but if we keep in mind that it used to have a very mature 90-foot tall neighbor that would buffer and slow down some of those winds, we can have issues with limbs or trees, falling over. Now I'm not trying to scare you, because if you'll notice on this tree, even in the upper canopy, we're seeing a tremendous amount of new growth. And what direction is it on? It's chasing that sunlight. Phototropism again. It's really trying to fill that void from the tree that was lost. So it is trying to right itself as best as it can. Now, it will take it 20, 30 years to develop into another mature organism on this side, but certainly it's going to do its job to try and self-right. So the gardens are a great place to be. If you've not visited, I certainly recommend it. It's a great place to look at, some mature plants, some that are not mature. It's a good way to look at the different changes throughout the season. Wonderful fall color, foliage, fruit. So there's just so much here to look at. I'm glad the UT Gardens allowed us an opportunity to shoot here. So no tree talk is complete without talking about Leland cypress trees, right? We all know Leland cypress. Oftentimes we monoculture Leland cypress trees. And if you haven't heard that term monoculture, that simply means taking one species and planting 25, 30 of them in a row. Anything more than 3 or 4 is really becoming a monoculture. Now, monocultures are really important. That's how we farm our food. That's where the idea came from, is through food production. We have one row of soybeans that's 150 feet long. When we do that with our ornamental trees and plants, shrubs, we run into some serious issues, or we certainly can. The reason being is because, number one, we oftentimes plant them when they're small trees, and we plant them too close together. These are Leland cypress. They get about 25 feet wide at the base one day. So certainly they will fill in a screen very quickly, but what happens when that screen becomes so overcrowded that we start to get limbs that are rubbing into one another? We, of course, inhibit the amount of sunlight and air that can penetrate through those canopy. So instead, what we see is an increase in fungal pathogens that become really, really, prevalent in the canopy. But the bigger problem is, well, if we do get one that becomes infected with a fungal pathogen, such as Ceridium canker, we've seen that this year, well, all of a sudden, it has a host next to it, and a host next to it, and a host next to it. And that can quickly get out of hand. Oftentimes, it means more management. You have to spend more money managing a whole row of 30 of the same species than you would a row that's very diverse and has multiple different evergreen species. That way, if a big drought comes through, like last year, we had a severe flash drought that has killed many of our mature Leland cypress and arborvitae trees, we don't lose the entire row. We may lose 1 or 2 if we have a diverse landscape, but it doesn't mean that our whole view is suddenly exposed where we once had it blocked. So with that, I want to really, really try and promote diverse landscapes, proper selection of nursery stock. Be sure to investigate those roots. Look for injuries on the tree trunk. spend more time planting the tree than you do researching the tree. I can't say that enough. And just make sure the tree is left alone. For the most part, our biggest problems come in tree management when we start to overly manage them. If we get them off to a good start, they can have centuries of growth, decades of growth sometimes in urban settings. I know the urban setting is a little harsher, so we don't oftentimes see centuries out of our urban trees, but many decades.
Thank you, Lee. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I believe that's it. Thank you all for hanging in there with us. Every time I go out to shoot a video, it seems to rain. So I'm sorry about the noise level on the rain, and thank you for staying with us. So have a great day, everyone.